One of the capabilities that was actually built into the very first personal computer released by IBM was the idea of expandability. Adapter cards actually add feature and functionality to the system. It could be video, it could be sound. There are an incredible array of adapters that cover almost every possibility. And when these features are added, it gives the system greater and enhanced capabilities. Let's just take a few moments to look through some of these types of adapters, what they can add, and how they can enhance whatever system you may be using.
So first, let's talk about video cards, because obviously they are an integral part of any computer system. Now, just in terms of an architectural standpoint, you're going to run into two basic adapter types. The first is integrated into the motherboard. This, of course, is certainly the norm for laptops, but even for desktops, many times video and sound and certain other functions are automatically built into the motherboard. The advantage of this is you don't have to have an expansion slot consumed by either a sound card or a video card. So frequently, that's the route you're going to take. Now, when certain functions are integrated into the motherboard, such as video, sound, and so forth, it's sometimes also called onboard. For instance, onboard video or onboard audio and so forth. So you need to keep those both in mind with this particular type of terminology. But there's also the external or separate adapter card, which does fit into the slot and obviously consumes resources. Many times the video that's available on the motherboard may be adequate, but if you want to do really high-powered gaming, you're normally going to have to use a card that actually has those capabilities. Now, just from a general standpoint, video graphic cards are sometimes just called graphic cards or graphic adapters. And when you have separately installed video cards, you may have a number of different slots on the motherboard that you're going to be using. It could be AGP, or the accelerated graphics port, largely being phased out, but was very popular at one time. There was also PCI, and obviously PCIe, PCI Express, which is actually what's used very popularly now. So let's actually drill down into the individual components that typically will compose the video card. Now you actually see a very high-end video card here. The first thing to keep in mind is the GPU, or graphics processing unit. This is a dedicated onboard video processor so that the system CPU doesn't have to be taxed. It's optimized for acceleration for 3D or 2D graphics rendering, and again, it takes pressure off of the CPU. Next, you have video memory. Most video cards have dedicated RAM installed. They could be soldered on, as you actually see here, or there could be the ability to be able to put them in different sockets. But there's different types of video memory. There's video RAM, or VRAM. There's synchronous graphics RAM, SGRAM, Windows RAM, WRAM, RAM. Then you have graphics DDR3, graphics DDR4, and graphics DDR5, which would just be the abbreviations GDDR3, 4, and 5, respectively. You also have the bus connector. This is actually where the card plugs into the actual motherboard and is able to do all of the processing. And then you have the display connectors. You actually see a couple here, and we'll detail more of them in a moment. You have at the very bottom of the card, you have the VGA, or Video Graphics Array Adapter, which is analog in nature and has been used for years. Next, you have the S-Video, which is actually the sort of black circular type of connector. And then you have the DVI, which is above that as well. There's also component video and some other types of connectors that you can actually use for graphics, but these are some of the ones that you'll see most commonly. So now let's actually take a look at some very popular video card display connectors. This is what's actually used to connect to the external monitor. So there's a couple of different types. We touched them just a moment ago, but let's do so again. First, you have the VGA. This is a DB15 type of connector. You can see it right there. It's been used almost since the very beginning of personal computing, and you'll typically find this on most graphics cards. And this is the pinout of the DB15, as you can see. Next, you have HDMI. One of the great things about HDMI is, first of all, it's high definition, hence HDMI, but it also carries both sound and video. A lot of laptops now will actually have HDMI connectors to be able to allow you to be able to connect to an HD TV. The VGA adapter, on the other hand, is purely video only, and it's analog in nature. HDMI is digital. You can see the pinouts here. Then you have the DVI, Digital Visual Interface, and there's more than one type. You can see there's single link, dual link, and so forth. But these are digital in nature, and they only carry the video. Sound has to be carried separately. Video cards certainly are one of the most popular expansion cards that you'll run into, but they are no means the only type. One of the other types of classifications of expansion cards are what's called multimedia cards. The first type, which may actually be the most familiar, are sound cards. These are used to both record and play audio. Typically, as you see pictured here, they can have both audio inputs and outputs. The inputs are used to be able to connect microphones, line level equipment, and so forth. Audio outputs are used to connect speakers and so forth. Typically, sound cards actually use a digital to analog conversion process to be able to create the analog sound, but it is also possible for sound cards to have a digital port where this type of digital information is actually passed directly rather than passed through the digital to audio conversion process. So look for the digital port on sound cards as well. Most sound cards are what's called Sound Blaster compatible because Creative Labs, which is the manufacturer of Sound Blaster cards, became what's called the de facto standard. And a formal standard is actually something that has been published and approved by some sort of standards body. A de facto standard is a standard in which there's such a broad adoption of that particular technology that it's considered just assumed. And that's basically the way Sound Blaster is. There are both internal and external connections to sound cards. And you usually have to load some type of software in order to be able to use them, or drivers and so forth. Variety of different types. So here you actually see the outputs of a sound card and just different connectors that you will typically run into. For line out, this is typically non-amplified sound, which is passed directly from the adapter, usually to some sort of system that does have amplification, such as a stereo and so forth. If you have different types of speaker outputs, you can actually have your subwoofer, your center, rear speakers, and so forth. The mic in is actually a microphone type of port where you would actually use some sort of external microphone one way or another. This is actually very simple for being able to record things. For instance, you could have a headset that has both speakers and microphones built into it. And then you have line in, which is actually going to some type of a device. Again, this is more of a non-amplified sound, sort of the inverse of the sound card line out type of port as we see here. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what is able to be connected to the external ports of sound cards. In addition to the external ports, there are also some internal connectors, as you see on the Sound Blaster card here, where you see TAD. This stands for Telephone Answering Device. And if you have an internal modem that's equipped with this, you can actually hook up this connector to the sound card so your computer can act as an answering machine, of course, using the right software. But you also see that the CD can connect to it, so you can actually play audio CDs on your system and then some sort of auxiliary system. But these are internal connectors that you may run into. In addition to video and multimedia type of cards, you also have a variety of interfaces that you can add to the system through expansion cards. Let's take a look at those now in this particular part of the lesson. Now first, we want to look at some common interface types. Now understand that these particular ports are typically integrated into the motherboard as you see pictured here. But many times they're also available as separate adapter cards. We're only going to touch on these right here because we're actually going to be dealing with input-output ports in a separate lesson. But here we have the parallel port, typically used for printers. The keyboard and mouse port, called PS2 ports, which we'll talk about later, typically for keyboard and mouse connections. Most now are actually done through USB. You have the serial port, which was used for external communications of some type, such as modems and so forth. And then you had USB ports, which obviously now have a primary use for what the PS2 ports used to be used for, as well as many more. Again, these are usually integrated into the motherboard, but are also available for installation as separate adapters. Now, located above the USB is actually a FireWire port. We'll actually deal with FireWire ports in our lesson on input-output connectors. But also right next to the keyboard and mouse connectors, you actually see a small phono-type jack. This is actually for sound. This is actually single-line sound. So just to be able to give you sort of a complete picture of what you're seeing here. But again, we're going to be dealing with these in a separate lesson. Number of different types of devices that you can use. The first are modems, which are actually used for dial-up communication. And they're called modems because it stands for modulator demodulator, because it takes digital data and turns it into analog tones for transmission over, obviously, analog telephone lines. These have largely become obsolete with the advent of broadband, but there may still be some situations in which you run into them. Now, an important point of clarification I'd like to make is sometimes when you hear the word modem, in the strictest technical sense, a modem is a modulator demodulator. That's where the name comes from. And it's actually used to be able to take digital data and turn it into analog signals for transmission over a standard telephone line. That's the strict technical definition. Now, in terms of just popular use names, you will hear like cable modem, DSL modem. They're not truly modems in the strictest sense, in the technical sense, because they're not doing modulation, demodulation. But since they perform a similar function as modems, in other words, acting as a gateway, that's typically why they're called that. So when you hear the word cable modem, DSL modem, realize that they're actually technically gateways. They're not really modems. Next, you have the network interface card, sometimes called a NIC, and this is for wired communication to some sort of networking infrastructure. In this case, it happens to be Ethernet, which you can actually see the RJ48 type port and jack right here. It's typically used to connect to networks, although now it's actually broadened into being able to connect to some type of internet type of devices as well. Not to be outdone, you have wireless cards, which actually create local area network connectivity, much like the NIC, but doing this in sort of a wireless type of an environment using radio waves. So you sort of call this a wireless network interface card. Another type of interface to be familiar with in the computing world is what is called SCSI. SCSI is an acronym for Small Computer Systems Interface. And when personal computing was actually beginning to come out and develop in all of its heyday in the past, SCSI was actually a very viable type of connector. Basically, this is referred to as a SCSI subsystem, or it could be called a SCSI bus, meaning all devices can simultaneously communicate on the bus. With the ISA bus and the PCI bus and so forth, there's contention, and you actually had to hard code at one time different IRQs, interrupt requests, in order to be able to get access to the system. SCSI didn't have that problem where you had to contend for access to the bus because all devices were able to connect and communicate simultaneously. It was more expensive, but it was a much faster and better system than was available at the time. So let's look how this is put together. And we talked about the SCSI bus, and we talked about different types of buses before. The system actually begins with your PC, which is pictured visually, sort of virtually here. Next, you have a SCSI adapter card, which again goes into an expansion slot and allows for this type of connectivity to take place. It supports both internal and external devices and can support between 8 to 16 devices connected in sort of a daisy chain, so each device having to be connected together. As you see here, we have 2 disk drives pictured. These would be SCSI hard drives. And again, you have the ribbon cable, daisy chaining all of these things together. You can also externally connect drives, as we talked about. But one of the things that you had to have is you had to have a terminating resistor at the very end in order to be able to close the circuit. It's not unlike early Ethernet networks. You actually have to have this resistor in order to be able to create the loop of the circuit. And each one of these devices that you see pictured has to have a unique SCSI ID number. If you only have 8 devices, it's 0 through 7. If you have the capability of 16 devices, it's going to be between 0 and 15. And this can be determined and programmed in using a variety of different methods. One way to do the SCSI ID settings is through, as you can see in this particular device, you can actually hard code, where there's basically a wheel in which you can actually increase or decrease the ID number. And you can see the SCSI connectors actually pictured to the right for the daisy chaining process. You can also do this through a series of switches that may be programmed in, for instance, on the back of this particular hard drive or CD drive, where you can actually select the number based on how the switches are actually programmed. And then there could be a series of jumpers which can actually accomplish the same thing. Again, each has to have a unique ID on the network in order to be able to communicate with the SCSI bus.
As we talked about earlier in the lesson, one of the purposes of the expansion card bus is to be able to add different capabilities to the system. While some motherboards have onboard video and audio and so forth, many times if you want to upgrade it, or if the system doesn't have it, you have to actually add these type of adapters. What we want to do now is just add a video card and a few other adapters just to be able to illustrate the purpose and point of being able to do this. So now we're actually going to add video capabilities to the system, and as you see here, we actually have a video card. You always want to make sure you pick these up by connectors, not by the conducting part here. You can actually see there's a spot in the system for it to go, which is right here. This is specifically a video card slot. So what we want to do is we'll actually take it in hand sort of like this. We make sure we have the end placed outward. Then we gently put it into position, and then it pops in just like that. Now we have the video connector sitting outside, and this will actually give us the capability of being able to use, in this case, a DVI connector. Now if we want to add a network card, you actually see the RJ45 slot here. Again, similar in terms of construction, very simple. And we place it in the system the same way. And we line it up. And again, it clicks into place. What we'll do here is we'll actually add a screw to secure the card. A little ornery, but we got it to go. These are screw-on, which actually helps. You don't have to actually have a tool to do it. And then, say we want to add some advanced sound card capabilities. So we'll actually do that with this device, which is a Sound Blaster compatible card. Lining it up, and again popping it into place, and securing it with another one of these twist-on screws. So just in this demo we've done right now, we've been able to add advanced video capabilities, networking capabilities, and multimedia sound, all with a couple of adapter cards. And that's how you simply expand your system.
So just to summarize, let's talk about just some terms. Multimedia, talking about adapter cards, is content that incorporates both video and audio. A video capture card, for example, this is a process of recording video from an external source onto a computer. These used to be dedicated cards. Now you can frequently have USB connected devices. SCSI, which we spent some time discussing, is Small Computer Systems Interface, a fast and high-powered communications bus that allows up to 15 devices to interface with a computer or server. And again, the key here was full availability without contention. And then modem, modulator-demodulator, a specialized communications device that converts data to and from analog sound for transmission across telephone lines.
So over the years, adapter cards have evolved substantially since the PC was first introduced. There are different slot types, different bus types, different adapter cards that are available, but what is not changing at all is the fact that those capabilities are here to stay. And so what we hope here at Train Signal is that our practical approach to this particular issue, as well as others, gives you the ability to be successful on the exam, in your job, and in your career. Thanks.